Welcome back to Sleeping with History. Today, we're going to take a look into the early life of America and the relationship of the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. Now, relax, rest, and drift off to sleep as we go through the Pilgrims and the Native Americans. Long before the Pilgrims ever set foot on the shores of New England, the northeast coast was already a lived-in world. Families had been fishing its waters, farming its soil, and traveling its rivers for thousands of years. The region was an empty wilderness. It was a homeland, shaped, organized, and understood by the people who lived here. Dozens of native nations lived across the Northeast: the Wampanoag, the Massachusetts, the Narragansett, and many, many more. Each had its own families, leaders, customs, and territories. Their boundaries were old. Their relationships, some friendly, some tense, were known to everyone. From the outside, a forest can look wild. But what Pilgrims saw in 1620 was not untouched nature. Native families managed the land carefully, controlled burns to clear underbrush, planting cycles designed for long-term soil health, fishing practices that protected spawning seasons, hunting rules that kept animal populations balanced, and pathways maintained between villages and trade points. This wasn't random survival. It was a system deep, old, and deliberate. Fields of corn, squash, and beans stretched near villages. Storage pits were filled with dry fish and harvested crops. Large homes stood in family clusters. Meeting houses hosted councils and gatherings. The Northeast was full of life. The Great Dying from 1616 to 1619. Everything changed when an epidemic swept through the region, brought unknowingly by earlier European traders. The exact disease is debated. Smallpox, viral hepatitis, or whatever it was devastating. Some villages lost 9 out of every 10 people. Entire communities collapsed. Camps went silent. Fields went unattended. Fishing wires broke without repair. Paths between villages, once busy, became overgrown. For survivors, grief was everywhere. For the Pilgrims, who arrived just after this catastrophe, the land looked strangely open, partly because so many had died and their entire settlements were now emptied. To the Pilgrims, it felt like divine intervention, but to the native survivors, it was a wound the newcomers couldn't see. Even before European settlers came, native politics were already complex. The Narragansett were powerful and mostly untouched by the epidemic. The Wampanoag had been devastated and were weakened. Rivalries, alliances, and tensions stretched across the region. When the Pilgrims arrived, they stepped into an existing political world, not an empty map. They didn't always understand that, but the native leaders did. For years before the Mayflower landed, native groups had encountered European sailors. Fishermen, fur traders, explorers, occasional raiders, and kidnappers, like the men who captured Squanto. Some experiences were cooperative, others were violent and left deep bitterness. So when the Pilgrims arrived, native communities didn't see them as a mystery. They saw them as another dangerous variable in a world already shifting. By the time the Mayflower reached the coast, the forests were quiet. Villages had gaps where families once stood. Rival nations were reassessing their power. Hunger was creeping into winter stores. Coastal groups were still recovering from loss, and inland groups were watching with caution. Two worlds were about to collide. One weakened by disease, one weakened by brutal ocean crossings. No side was invincible. No side fully understood the other, but both needed something. Before the Pilgrims ever touched American soil, their story was already shaped by fear, pressure, and a long struggle for survival. To understand how conflict later formed between them and the native nations of New England, it's important to understand who the Pilgrims were before they boarded the Mayflower. They were not soldiers, they were not conquerors, and they were not wealthy. They were families, farmers, craftsmen, children, just people trying to protect the way that they worshipped and lived. England in the early 1600s wasn't a peaceful place for religious dissenters. The Pilgrims believed the Church of England had become too close to the state and too far from what they considered true biblical practice. They believed the church needed to be simplified, purified, and separated from political control. The English government strongly disagreed. Speaking against the state church was dangerous. So was refusing to attend state-approved services. Fines were common, Arrests were possible. Some separatist leaders were jailed, some were watched closely. The Pilgrims believed they had two choices: change their beliefs or leave home and start over somewhere else. And they picked the harder path. Before America, the Pilgrims lived more than a decade in Holland. It gave them something England would not: freedom to worship the way they wanted. But freedom came with new problems. Life in Dutch cities was expensive, and wages were low. Pilgrim families often worked the hardest jobs: manual labor, long hours, and low pay. Their children began learning Dutch faster than English. They began adopting Dutch customs. Some Pilgrim leaders worried that their entire culture would fade within one generation. They didn't lose their faith, they didn't want to lose their identity. And they feared their children would grow up in a world they didn't fully recognize. So once again, they decided to move. Not across a border this time, across an ocean. America wasn't their first idea. They looked at several options: staying in Holland, moving to a different European region, joining another English colony, or returning to England and risking punishment. But America offered one thing they valued most: distant from government control. They hoped that by living far away from England, they could create a small community where they could practice their beliefs without interference. They didn't plan to replace native nations. They didn't imagine ruling a continent. They simply wanted a corner of land where they could exist in peace. Reality would be far more complicated. The Mayflower wasn't a passenger ship, it was a cargo vessel. Its decks were cramped, its ceilings low, and its ventilation terrible. About 102 passengers crowded inside, plus crew. Men, women, children, and infants. Some were pilgrims, some were not. Some were merchants, laborers, and hired hands. The crossing took 66 days. It was brutal. Storms repeatedly slammed the ship. People slept next to animals brought for breeding. Seasickness spread everywhere. Foul air filled the lower deck, and fresh food ran out early. The clean water turned stale. The waste piled up, and beams cracked so badly the crew feared the ship would break. The people prayed daily for survival. However, only one passenger died during the trip, but many arrived sick, weak, and exhausted. They expected to land in a region near modern-day New York, where they had legal permission to settle. Instead, because of the storms and navigation errors, they ended farther up north, a coastline they didn't know, and land already home to powerful native nations. Before stepping on land, the Pilgrims realized something. They had no legal authority to settle where they landed. Arguments broke out between passengers. Some claimed they would establish rules. They wouldn't have to follow anyone's leadership. To prevent chaos, the Pilgrims drafted the Mayflower Compact, a simple agreement that everyone would follow. It wasn't democracy in the modern sense, but it was forced unity at a moment when unity was needed. They signed it on November 11, 1620, and hours later they began exploring the shoreline. Their first impressions of the New World. It was cold, silent, and unfamiliar. They landed in November. Terrible timing. Winter already creeping in, and the air was sharp with frost. The forests were thick. The land sloped downward towards the bays and marshes. Small rivers cut through the hills. The coastline was dotted with old storage pits, abandoned fields, and empty homes from recent epidemics. They explored cautiously, rifles ready, unsure of who was watching. From the trees, and the natives were watching. Not approaching it, not speaking, just observing. The Pilgrims didn't understand the land. The native nations did not yet understand the newcomers. Still, neither side fired a shot. Not yet. The Pilgrims' first winter became one of the darkest periods in early colonial history. They lacked warm shelter and enough food, proper clothing, medicine, knowledge of the land, immunity to new sickness, and help from the environment. Nearly half of the Pilgrims died in that first winter. Cold, hunger, infection, and exposure took them out quickly. Some families were wiped out entirely. Children lost, parents lost children. Bodies were buried quietly, sometimes at night, to hide their weakness from the nearby native groups. By spring, only 52 of the original 102 were alive. The colony's failure seemed almost certain. By the time spring arrived, their numbers were low. Their supplies were almost gone. They had almost no chance of surviving another winter. They didn't understand the land, they didn't know the people who lived there, and they were desperate. This desperation shaped everything that came next. It shaped their dependence on native allies, it shaped the early peace, it shaped the later tension, and it shaped the even later wars. Two worlds were now forced into contact, one weakened by an ocean, the other weakened by distance. For a brief moment, both needed something from the other. The fragile balance would define the next years, and eventually break. The Pilgrims survived another winter, but only barely. Their numbers were reduced, their food nearly gone, and their bodies weak from months of sickness and cold. When spring arrived in 1621, they faced a simple truth. They couldn't survive alone. They needed allies, they needed knowledge, and they needed help understanding the land they now lived on. And whether they knew it or not, native nations were already watching them closely. The Pilgrims had been seeing signs. Footprints in the snow, arrows left behind, fishing weirs repaired near rivers, smoke rising far from camp, and glimpses of movement between trees. These weren't random encounters. Native scouts were monitoring the newcomers, watching their habits, studying their defenses, counting their numbers, and trying to understand whether or not they were dangerous. Neither side understood the other yet, but both sides were cautious. During their first winter explorations, the Pilgrims unknowingly entered the remains of an abandoned native village, the home of Squanto before the epidemic. They found cleared fields, buried storage pits filled with corn, empty houses, tools, and signs that people had once lived here. Some Pilgrims took stored corn when they had no food. They meant to pay back the owners later, but the act created tension before they even met face to face. To the native survivors, this looked like theft. To the Pilgrims, it felt like desperation. Neither side communicated the misunderstanding. Not yet, anyway. On March 16, 1621, something happened that shocked the Pilgrims. A native man walked straight into Plymouth. Alone, calm, and confident. His name was Samoset. The Pilgrims were stunned when he greeted them in English. Samoset wasn't from the immediate area, he came from farther east, where he had met European fishermen over the years. That contact allowed him to learn broken English, enough to speak, enough to trade, and enough to communicate. The Pilgrims fed him, listened to him, and cautiously welcomed him. After months of uncertainty, the walls of silence between the two worlds began to crack. A few days later, Samoset returned, but this time he wasn't alone. With him was Squanto, a man whose knowledge of English and European customs was far greater. Squanto's life story was tragic. He was kidnapped by English traders years earlier. He was taken across the ocean, learned English, lived in Spain and England, and eventually found a way home. He returned to discover his entire village dead from the epidemic. He was a survivor of two worlds, and possibly the only man alive who could function comfortably in both. The Pilgrims immediately recognized how valuable he was, and the native leaders recognized it too. Not long after, the most important native leader in the region, Massasoit, approached Plymouth. This was not a casual visit. Massasoit brought dozens of warriors, not in range, in caution, armed, disciplined, and watching every move. The Pilgrims, nervous but hopeful, faced them with their own weapons ready. This was one of the most tense moments in the early American history. If anything went wrong, a fight would have broken out instantly. But nothing did go wrong. Squanto acted as a translator, Samoset ensured calm, and Massasoit kept his warriors still, and the Pilgrims listened. The Pilgrims and Massasoit negotiated a treaty that changed the future of New England. If either side was attacked, the other would help. If disputes happened, punishment would be fair. If someone stole from the other, it would be returned. This wasn't a peace born from friendship. It was peace born from a necessity. Massasoit agreed because his people had been devastated by the epidemic. Rival groups, especially the Narragansett, threatened them. He needed allies, and English guns were useful. English trades also brought good value. The Pilgrims needed help because they were starving. They didn't understand the land. They were outnumbered. They had weak defenses, and without native help, they would fail. Both sides saw an advantage, both sides saw potential danger, but both sides chose cooperation. After the treaty, Squanto stayed with the Pilgrims full-time. He became the interpreter, a teacher, a guide, a cultural translator, and a mediator during disputes. He taught them how to grow corn the native way, how to fertilize with fish, how to find edible plants, how to trap local game, and how to survive the seasons. Without him, the colony almost certainly would have collapsed. But Squanto's position between the two worlds was complicated. Some other leaders didn't fully trust him. Some Pilgrims feared they relied on him too much. His presence often created peace, but sometimes tension. The first spring and summer included genuinely good moments. The Pilgrims and natives exchanged gifts. Trade between the groups increased. Children from both sides watched each other curiously. Local native warriors demonstrated hunting techniques. Pilgrims shared tools and metal goods. Misunderstandings were resolved peacefully. Games, meetings, and shared meals happened occasionally. These weren't mythical senses of perfect harmony. They were moments of two cultures genuinely trying to understand each other. Some Pilgrims grew to respect the natives deeply. Some native families saw the Pilgrims as useful partners. This brief window of cooperation is simplified today, but in reality it was built on careful diplomacy and practical need. Even in the peaceful months, there were problems brewing. Some Pilgrims assumed too quickly that the land was open for use. Some native families resented Pilgrim expansion. Tools or crops went missing on both sides. Suspicion rose whenever misunderstandings happened. Accusations sometimes flew without evidence, and rival tribes viewed the alliance with hostility. The relationship was fragile, and conflict was always one bad moment away. Early in 1621, a group of small Pilgrims confronted a Native American man who had taken tools from one of their work sites. The native man insisted that he believed the tools were abandoned. Neither fully understood each other's cultural norms of ownership, but instead of violence, they resolved the issue diplomatically. The Massasoit intervened, the tools were returned, and peace was held. This small event showed something important. Early conflicts didn't always end in violence. Both sides worked to keep the peace alive. That fall, the Pilgrims held a harvest celebration. When native warriors appeared, they weren't invited guests in the modern sense. They were responding to the sound of Pilgrim gunfire, which they interpreted as a possible threat. When they arrived, armed and ready, the situation could have gone bad. But instead, the Massasoit joined. Native hunters brought deer to contribute. Pilgrims shared their small harvest. Food was exchanged. Games were played. Spears and muskets stayed at the rest. It wasn't a national holiday. It wasn't a symbol of unity. It wasn't a yearly tradition. It was a moment, just one, where peace outweighed fear. By the end of their first year, the Pilgrims were alive. The Wampanoag alliance was holding. Small disputes had been resolved. Trade was increasing. Mutual dependence was real. Both sides had reason to maintain peace. But below the surface, misunderstandings simmered. Cultural differences grew. Land use became a concern. Pressure from the rival tribes increased, and both sides watched the other carefully. The early months of harmony were real, but temporary. The hardest chapters were still ahead. The Pilgrims entered their first spring with only half their numbers alive. Those who survived were weakened. Their food stores were nearly empty, and their knowledge of the land was still limited. The Wampanoag, too, were emerging from their own years of hardship. The Great Dying had reduced their population drastically. Entire families were missing. Some villages still sat abandoned. Both groups needed to rebuild. Both needed stability. And for a short time, their goals aligned. The Wampanoag and their families did not hand the Pilgrims survival. They taught them how to earn it. Squanto, acting as an interpreter and guide, showed the Pilgrims how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, how to select the right patches of cleared land, how to harvest plants safely, how to use local herbs for basic sickness, how to find fish runs in certain seasons, and how to set eel traps in the streams. Without these lessons, the Pilgrims' farming season would have failed. Their harvest would have collapsed. Their children would have starved. Even with the help, success wasn't guaranteed, but the odds improved dramatically. During the first year, there were many calm, positive moments. The native families visited the colony for trade. Pilgrim children watched native hunters demonstrate bow making. Women from both sides compared food preparation methods. Small gift exchange happened: fish, corn, tools, and cloth. Meetings between leaders occurred without hostility, and cooperative hunts were organized on rare occasions. These weren't staged events, they were practical exchanges between people trying to coexist. Some Pilgrims began to respect native knowledge deeply. Some Wampanoag saw the Pilgrims as potential lifelong partners. But the peace wasn't perfect. Even in the moments of cooperation, two worlds never fully understood each other. Pilgrims believed in private land ownership. Natives saw the land as shared, managed by family groups, never owned in the European sense. When the Pilgrims fenced off fields, some native families viewed it as aggressive. When the native hunters passed through those fields, Pilgrims saw it as trespassing. Neither side meant harm, but misunderstandings grew slowly. The native families often traded furs, deer meat, fish, corn, herbs, in exchange for metal tools, knives, kettles, cloth, beads, and small firearms or powder, in rare cases. But the firearms created tension. Pilgrims worried armed native groups might turn hostile. Native groups wanted equal access to tools and weapons, and rival tribes grew suspicious of the alliance. The trade was helpful, but complicated. Pilgrims misread native expressions of politeness. Native diplomats misread Pilgrim formality. In Wampanoag culture, silence could be respectful. To Pilgrims, silence could feel threatening. Pilgrims valued written agreements. Native leaders valued verbal agreements backed by reputation. Neither was wrong, but both were unfamiliar. Several incidences during this year could have exploded into violence. Pilgrims accused a native man of stealing tools, and the native man believed the tools were abandoned. During a diplomatic meeting, Pilgrim militia performed a firing drill. They wanted to demonstrate strength, to show that they were capable of defending themselves. To the Wampanoag warriors, the display felt threatening, but Squanto explained the intent, and tension softened. Pilgrim hunting parties occasionally traveled too far into territories used by the Wampanoag or nearby tribes. Warnings were given out, apologies offered, and no fight broke out. All of these moments show how fragile peace truly was. Amid the tensions, there were also real friendships forming. Pilgrims admired native tracking skills. Some Wampanoag admired Pilgrim carpentry. Native hunters shared stories of ancestors and legends. Pilgrims shared their own life experiences from across the ocean. Squanto developed close ties with several Pilgrim families. Children learned each other's games from afar. These interactions were small but meaningful. They showed that the cooperation wasn't an illusion. It wasn't just guaranteed forever. By the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims harvested their first successful crop in the New World. Corns, beans, squash, small amounts of barley, and vegetables from English seeds. It wasn't massive, but it was enough. The Pilgrims were relieved. The Massasoit were satisfied. Squanto was respected even more. The colony would survive another winter, not comfortably, but safely. The early alliance between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag held firm for several years. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Both sides got something from it. Both sides benefited from cooperation, and both sides avoided major conflict. But peace in the early New England was never guaranteed. Not with more ships on the horizon, not with rival native nations watching closely, not with cultural misunderstandings still unresolved, and not with two different worlds trying to live on the same land. By the mid-1620s, pressure was growing from every direction. The calm first years were ending, and the tensions were beginning. The biggest change came slowly at first, and then all at once. It was a growing English population, more ships, more families, and more settlers. Every year, new English colonists arrived, people who weren't part of the original Pilgrim group, people with different goals, different expectations, and different ideas about how the land should be used. The Pilgrims weren't trying to build a nation, but the newcomers were. Within a decade, new towns appeared, more forest cleared, more farmland expanded, more fences were built, and more English livestock roamed freely. There was a growing distrust amongst each other. On the Pilgrim side, not everyone trusted the Wampanoag. Pilgrims' guards often kept muskets loaded even during peaceful trade visits, and the night watches were increased. Rumors spread that native warriors might attack during winter. Some settlers from incoming ships feared savages, even though they had never spoken to a native person. Fear didn't come from reality, it came from not understanding each other's world. Still, the treaty held, and no major fight broke out. Peace continued, but the cracks were visible. The Wampanoag were the only people watching the Pilgrims. Other native nations, especially the Narragansett, saw the English alliance as a direct threat. The Narragansett were powerful, mostly untouched by the epidemic, and historical rivals of the Wampanoag. To them, the Pilgrims were not potential allies. They were an opportunity or a danger. At one point, a Narragansett leader sent the Pilgrims a symbolic challenge, a bundle of arrows wrapped in snakeskin. It was a warning. The Pilgrims sent it back stuffed with gunpowder, meaning, "We are ready to fight." No war came from this moment. The Massasoit worked hard to prevent it, but the message was clear. Peace existed, but the region around them was full of pressure. Squanto was invaluable to the Pilgrims. He was also controversial amongst the Wampanoag. Some Wampanoag leaders believed Squanto acted too independently, used his influence to gain personal power, threatened rival villages, and strengthened his own ties with the English. And now the first major fights were ready to go down. Even during years of cooperation, violence did occur on both sides. In 1621, just months after the alliance began, the Pilgrims organized a military raid against a native group called the Nauset. Why? A Pilgrim boy from the colony had disappeared near the Nauset territory. The Pilgrims feared he had been captured, and tensions rose fast. The Pilgrims armed themselves and prepared for violent retaliation. But when they arrived, they learned the truth. The boy had simply wandered off. A Nauset family found him, fed him, and kept him safe until the Pilgrims arrived. No fighting happened, and the child was returned unharmed. Still, the tension from the armed expedition remained. Over the next years, Pilgrim parties occasionally had arrows fired near them. English guards fired warning shots at perceived threats. Native warriors confronted Pilgrim hunters for overstepping their boundaries. Villages feared each other's sudden movements. The rumors fueled distrust. These weren't wars, but they were sparks, and the sparks add up. In 1623, the Massasoit became gravely sick, near death. Pilgrim leader Edward Winslow personally visited him, bringing him broth, medicine, and comfort. Winslow stayed at his side for days, helping him breathe, helping him drink, and helping him survive. The Massasoit recovered, barely, and never forgot the Pilgrims' care. This moment strengthened peace more than any treaty. It showed genuine human loyalty, not strategy, not politics, and not fear. But no leader lives forever. And when Massasoit eventually passed years later, the next generation didn't inherit the same calm diplomacy. The seeds of conflict were already planted. By the late 1620s, Plymouth and the Wampanoag still shared trade, diplomacy, occasional friendship, and mutual respect. But they also shared land disagreements, cultural differences, fear, misunderstandings, resentment on both sides, pressure from the outside tribes, and growing imbalance in population. All of this moved the region toward an unavoidable future: conflict. By the 1630s, the small, fragile world the Pilgrims had built was changing rapidly. Plymouth was no longer an isolated outpost struggling to survive. It was becoming a part of a much larger English presence, one that neither the Pilgrims nor the native nations had fully anticipated. The early years of cooperation were still remembered, and many peaceful interactions continued. Trade still flowed, diplomacy still happened, families still exchanged goods and shared occasional meals. But everything around the peace was shifting: population, land, power, and pressure. The balance between the English and the native nation was changing, and it was changing fast. For a while, the trade remained strong. Native families exchanged beaver furs for metal tools, knives, kettles, cloth, iron pots, beads, and sometimes guns or powder. But beaver populations began to decline from overhunting, an industry driven heavily by the English demand. As furs grew scarce, native families struggled to keep up. Their economic leverage weakened, English traders became pickier, and the prices shifted in the English favor. Trade that used to be a partnership now was becoming an imbalance. The Pilgrims and later Puritans were deeply religious, and they believed their beliefs were the correct path. Many native nations practiced spiritual traditions tied to land, seasons, ancestors, and community. Their religions were woven into the rhythm of daily life. The Puritans often misunderstood these beliefs as superstition, or worse, paganism. Some Puritan missionaries pushed for conversion. Some native families resisted strongly, some were curious, and some converted. Religion didn't cause immediate fighting, but it added another layer of difference, one more area where neither side understood the other. Despite rising tension, there were still bright spots: cooperative hunts, shared medical help, exchange of foods, children quietly playing near one another at trading sites, native guides safely escorting English travelers, pilgrims helping native families during harsh winters, and peaceful negotiations between towns and villages. The death of Massasoit. Massasoit, the archetype of early peace, eventually died in the early 1660s, after decades of diplomacy. His passing changed everything. With him gone, the most respected voice for cooperation vanished, and the Pilgrims lost their most trusted ally. His oldest son, Wamsuta, or as they call him Alexander, became leader. He tried to maintain peace, he tried to work with the English, but tensions escalated fast. English officials summoned him repeatedly for questioning, and he grew ill shortly after one of these meetings and died unexpectedly. Many of the Wampanoag believed he was poisoned, but there was no proof, but the suspicion hardened their hearts. By the summer of 1675, the fragile balance that held the region together for more than 50 years finally snapped. What followed was one of the most devastating conflicts in the early American history. Short, fast, chaotic, and brutal on both sides. This war was not a war of professional armies. It was a war of towns and villages, a war of families and communities. A war fought in forests, marshes, rivers, and fields. A war built from decades of fear and pressure finally boiling over, and neither side was prepared for how destructive it would become. The war began not with a grand attack, but with small sparks, a raid on an English settlement, a retaliatory strike on the Wampanoag village, a militia patrol firing into the woods, a warrior's ambush on a lonely road. Soon every small act of violence set off a larger one. Swansea, an English town, became one of the first major flashpoints. Wampanoag warriors, believing war was now unavoidable, attacked isolated homes and farms first. Small strikes meant to warn, destabilize, and disrupt. English settlers fled to fortified houses. Messengers carried word from town to town that Philip's men were attacking. English militia responded immediately, burning Wampanoag villages in retaliation, some belonging to families who had not taken part in the raid. Both sides saw themselves as responding to aggression. Both believed they were defending their people. Both saw the other as who started it, and the war escalated. As the winter approached, native forces faced a devastating challenge. They lacked supplies. The Wampanoag warriors had early successes, but the war disrupted their hunting, fishing, farming, storage, trade, and travel. By winter, food shortages became severe. Meanwhile, the English, though also suffering, had fortified towns, steady supply from coastal ships, better gunpowder stores, and warm shelters. Winter hit the native communities far harder. Starvation spread, cold killed many, villages weakened, allies drifted away, and the morale dropped. The English saw this and pressed harder. One of the most damaging moments of the war was the Great Swamp Fight in December of 1675, when the English attacked a fortified Narragansett village in the frozen marshes of what is now Rhode Island. The Narragansett had not fully committed to war yet. They had sheltered refugees, including Wampanoag women and children. English militia saw this as aiding the enemy. They marched across the frozen marshes, surrounded the fort, and attacked. The fighting was bloody and chaotic. Hundreds of native people were killed. Many were burned alive when the homes caught fire. Winter shelters and food stores were destroyed. Survivors fled into the cold, many dying from exposure. This attack forced the Narragansett fully into the war, a war they had tried to avoid. By 1676, the war began to turn against the native coalition. Starvation, desertion, internal tension, English numbers, and betrayals. Village after village fell, and families scattered. The Wampanoag Confederacy fractured. Though the English ultimately won the war, the price was staggering. The crops were destroyed, homes burned, trade interrupted, debts increased, and settlers impoverished. Survivors described lifelong fear, suspicion of all native neighbors, trauma from burned towns, grief for the loss of family members, and bitterness and distrust. The war hardened English attitudes. Many settlers became more aggressive toward native land claims. The laws tightened, movement restrictions increased, and the tolerance was decreased. Peace was no longer seen as cooperation, it was seen as control. Not all native nations fought with Metacomb. Some sided with the English. The Mohegan, some Christian praying Indians, and individuals from smaller tribes. These alliances helped the English survive early defeats, but even for native allies, the aftermath was painful. Before the war, the region was a network of native nations with English colonies living among them. After the war, the balance changed. The English population dominated, and native land was drastically reduced. The laws were rewritten, and the native leaders lost authority. This didn't mean that the native nations disappeared. They didn't, and they survived, but their political world was transformed. Despite devastation, the native families rebuilt. Some native survivors blended English customs into their lives out of necessity. Some retreated deeper into the traditional ways, and some moved to new regions to avoid English control. The fields, rivers, and forests of New England still hold memory of what happened here. The abandoned villages, the old trails, rebuilt towns, the graves of settlers, the sacred grounds of native nations, places where the peace was signed, places where battles raged. The land remembers all of it, and in telling the story, we acknowledge the hope, the pain, and the people on both sides who did their best in impossible times. History doesn't rest, it echoes. This has been Sleeping with History, where the past truly never rests, and neither do we.